How are you? I know you were waiting for Miss Pinto, the dean. I am not her, but I am going to speak on her behalf. I'm Silvia Nona. I'm the academic secretary of this university. And also, I am an environmentalist. I am a teacher of environmental rights, of environmental resources, natural resources. And apart from welcoming the organizers, I would like to thank them for having me in this event and also for having organized it. I believe that for many of you, it's your and in our school, in our university. As you have seen, it's now one of the top universities internationally. And this ranking has a lot to do not only with educational quality, with our courses of studies, specializations we offer, but also since we are always open and we are always thrilled to be able to welcome experts that gather in order to report to us, generate new ideas, raise new concerns, even propose solutions. There is nothing more important in society than to be well informed and well trained. And this, it is my understanding, is what today you will be doing at this symposium, and I'm pretty sure of it. I would like to thank the organizers as a secretary, as an environmentalist, as a professor, but also on my personal behalf as Sylvia, as just one more human being who shares these interests and willing to take care of our environment. Last week, we celebrated the Environment Day. And you know that this is a day that is celebrated at world level since 1973 because it was established as the International Day of Environment at the first meeting of the United Nations in Stockholm in 1972. And it was on this day that the relevance of the environment is highlighted. The United Nations every year has a motto. This year it was so broad, this motto. It was something like to join man with nature in all continents from north to south. And when we met here, we were perhaps more realistic or humble. And we also had a motto for our sessions, and it was let's talk about small actions that make a difference. So that day, we proposed some activities that our university has been conducting in order to begin with, and you might be or not familiar with this. We have the largest green roof in a public building in the city of Buenos Aires. Before, it used to be concrete, and below it was a kindergarten. Now we have a green rooftop. It's winter, so you cannot really see much of it right now. But in spring, we have beautiful flowers. For a year and a half, we've been working on El Seibo Cooperative through an agreement, and we get scraps from paper, glass, and other materials, and these people collect them and they make money out of our garbage. And these are small actions that set a difference. You will be speaking about bigger things today. Undoubtedly, they also make a difference because the world has changed. Society also has been modified through these changes, and there are new needs, new objectives, and we have adapted. And we have adapted ourselves to the environment many times without planning or measuring the consequences. But the meeting that you will have today is focused precisely on this, to stop for a moment, reflect, analyze the situation, see where we stand, see what can be done and how it can be done all together. Undoubtedly, there are changes. There have been changes. We must adapt. But also, it is very important to be ready to receive these changes and that they don't generate unwanted consequences. So, I would like to welcome you once more.
Buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Silvia Nona, also Manuel Jaramillo, who's here with me, coordinating this first panel, and all the people visiting us from Argentina and from abroad. We are truly pleased, firstly, for having representatives of the work movement, and we believe that is one of the objectives. I represent the Energy Regulatory Agency, SEARE, that has been working for over 20 years here at this university and which has a very important commitment to the environment and its future through energy policies. And SEARE itself, as you know very well, is part of the energy scheme since a long time ago, 2012 up to 2030, and we are also planning until 2035. Also thinking that, as Sylvia said some time ago, these issues cannot be solved in a short-term policy. We need to sit down, plan ahead. So the reason why we are truly thankful of being here is that we believe these are the aspects of the future agenda. SEARE, as a postgraduate center, must be present in a session that is about work transition in energy fields. It is undoubted that a new paradigm is taking place, and I believe this is what it's all about, the change of paradigm applied to new technologies and to new jobs. That is key. That is why we are here, and that is why we count with the possibility of contributing with anything that you might need. And that's all from me. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here. It is quite an honor for us to be here. For about 2 or 3 months, when we discussed this with our friends at WWF, an institution that Fundación Vida Silvestre has been representing in Argentina for over 30 years, we were presented with a very relevant challenge. This is a new issue, an issue that, as the people before me spoke about, is coming, is hot for the next years, and how an environmentalist NGO can discuss these issues, open the game, without actually having that much experience in the field and without being a leader in these issues. That is why, when we decided to take the challenge, we thought we couldn't do it alone, and that is why we invited our friends, especially from FAN and SEARE. Thank you so much for being here, and that's what made us think it was possible to contribute in order to increase the relevance of this issue in our country. And this is our intention at Fundación Vida Silvestre, to open up the dialogue, to start a debate, and to build or to start building a roadmap in terms of what must we do as a country, as a group of institutions that are diverse but are complementary, so that this transition be fair. And it is also important to reflect on the environmentalist side the evolution so far. Fundación Vida Silvestre, as I said, is the representative of WWF, an institution that has started to change its profile, including financial issues, business issues, governance issues, as cross-cutting issues on the most pressing environmental issues. Energy and climate change is one of them, and that's where we can see or put into practice something that we know, and sometimes that can be difficult for environmental NGOs, and it is to find a solution not so much from field and conservation, or not only, but also from the social economic viewpoint. This is a big challenge because in many of our institutions, professionals are related somehow to biology or natural sciences. That's why we are incorporating different professionals from other areas, and we are trying to find openings, as I was saying before, information, training to other issues. And here is where we can have very rich scenarios in which we can work jointly in implementing the solutions. Now, regarding the issue at hand, I would like to reflect on the three words of our meeting: transition. From a biological viewpoint, we can say that our world is constantly ongoing a moment of transition or evolution, and that is desirable, and we can relate this to evolution. Our planet is what it is. And the transition processes, and I insist, related to evolution, many times favor certain individuals and don't favor others. And if we speak from a natural viewpoint, we can say this is desirable. But when we start including the social variable, and when we start thinking about the world that we want, that is not so desirable anymore. And that's why the challenge is that these transitions, we hope, be for the best, and it is inclusive, allowing us not only to recognize ourselves as a new community with a greater relation to the environment, but a community that is moving towards a low carbon economy, but also providing opportunities to all. Now, regarding energy, undoubtedly, energy has changed the world, and here there are specialists that will address these issues. But this morning I was thinking, since someone started inventing the wheel or the lever, and the pyramids could be built going to the energy issues today, that can allow us to see the effect that the use of energy can have in our society in terms of transformation. Also, how do we manage energy? Energy is undoubtedly one of the power elements that countries have that may enable or not the development of investments of companies that may decide where to set up based on energy. This force of change hopefully can be directed so that this change favors everyone, and that's where fairness comes in, equality. And what better place in Argentina than the Faculty of Law to speak about this? And I believe it is important also to see how can we be bigger than this in terms of development models and ideological models. There is a great challenge here. That's why it's also relevant for us to meet in the middle and find a good solution, a technical team looking for solutions in terms of trying to find a point of contact, unifying our thoughts, joining ideas. Some people question the concept of social equality, social justice, or fairness. And this country has been a leader in workers' rights providing for opportunities of development at different levels of society. That's why it is relevant, I believe, that we defend the rights of people, the rights of workers, in this moment in which the world is changing and is setting up new rules of the game. We cannot think that the change will just attract those people who are able to change. We must be responsible in terms of generating mechanisms so that this change includes as many people as possible, and those who are left out are left also with opportunities that will allow them to carry on with their lives. I am a forestry engineer, and that's why I can't help discuss things in my field of expertise. Forestry has been included in this for almost 70 years when there were people who worked on this by hand. Then came technology and the electric saw, and many could work the electric saw, but also when harvesters appeared and different machinery that did the work by themselves, what happened to the people? And for companies, of course, it was much more interesting investing in this machinery. They broke down, but they didn't get sick, for instance, and they didn't have any claims in terms of working hours, conditions, generating fewer problems. Very few companies have invested through corporate social responsibility program in training program or voluntary retirement, creating alternative jobs, many times in nurseries. For instance, a man who works with a saw is probably tired and probably comes from a social sector that hasn't had a lot of training in order to adjust, and to stop their job meant affecting them deeply.
That's why, considering this example of the forestry activity and how poorly regulated it was, we were lucky to be in a transition that still holds. There are still companies that can provide the service which work with electric saw operators. But inspired in what I know from the forestry system and raising to the challenge of the energy change, which undoubtedly is faster and will have a bigger impact than just the forestry sector, all of us have to make a commitment to facilitating this energy transition so that it's fair and to promote joint work so that all of us together may achieve a fairer world with a low carbon economy. And we have to do this together because that's the only way. It is possible to do it together. Together we can change this reality. And we have to move forward beyond our sector of personal interests. We have to follow our common interests. I don't want to take up more time. Thank you for your attention, and we hope that this meeting will be interesting to start discussions about the topics in our country. Thank you. Thank you very much. Today we will listen to Annabella Rosenberg. Annabella Rosenberg is an authority, international authority in fair energy transition. She works in the International Trade Union Confederation, which has its headquarters in Brussels and Paris. Welcome. I don't know where you want me to speak. Good morning. My plane has just landed, so I hope you will excuse any foreign words or just my lack of attention, because I had a 13-hour flight and it was really tiresome. First of all, I would like to thank my friends of WWF, but also to our local friends, the Fundación Vida Silvestre, the FAB friends, the people from the Center of Studies of the University of Buenos Aires. Obviously, acronyms won't work this morning either. And I would like to thank all of my trade union partners who are here and who also made possible that I would be able to come. Santiago, I work for the International Trade Union Confederation, which, as its name states, it's a confederation of confederations. We represent over over 300 trade union organizations in all the world, in 150 countries. My work at the Confederation consists of coordinating, supporting the trade union movement in understanding environmental issues, among other things, in particular climate change, over the last few years. And of course, obviously, we are not an environmentalist organization, but I would like to say this beforehand because what you will listen to is environmentalist, because the trade union movement is changing. It is increasingly integrating, and I think better and better, the environmental dimension to the economic model that we need to build. And this discussion about the concept of fair transition has been perhaps one of the driving forces that has enabled us to participate of the environmental debate with our own vocabulary. The environmental debate for a long time has been passionately defended by many organizations. Very often, the trade union movement felt foreign, alien to that debate, with a few exceptions, perhaps in issues about occupational health, exposure to hazardous substances, and things which were directly related to pollution and workers' health. But it was difficult to create a link or a feeling of legitimacy for an area that for a long time was not our own. There was an idea that the environment is for the environmentalists, work is for the trade unions, and that there were no common spaces to generate a dialogue. The idea of a fair transition helped us to build a bridge between those spaces, but also to develop our own ideas about how to address, from the social justice viewpoint and from the point of view of advancing workers' rights, the environmental issue, which is so complex. As I was saying, I work in the international arena, although I'm Argentine, as you may have noticed. But I do not work about Argentina alone. And our analysis from the CCI is not new, but no doubt it causes a lot of concern about our situation in the world from the environmental and social viewpoints. If we take a look from the environmental side, probably you have worked on this already, but the fact that we are experiencing climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the degradation of a number of ecosystems and different species, but also the dissemination of chemicals, contamination of water. This economic model moves forward towards the possibility of our generation and future generations to reach their development and prosperity goals. From the social point of view, you won't be surprised to know that our evaluation of the situation is critical, not just because of the advance of inequalities, which have never been so big in our planet. There is also the problem of unemployment, but even more terrible, if something can be more terrible than unemployment percentages, are the precariousness rates and an employment model that increasingly burdens the work with insecurity and recovers for the benefit of a very few people. It recovers benefits for very few people. It is the entire economic model that is taking us to create spaces or a fertile ground so that many backward conservative ideas, which we could also call reactionary, such as the advance of the far right in many countries. But there are also options which do not call themselves far right but are still very backward for communities like the Trump. All of those options stem and develop thanks to a fertile ground of inequality, fear, and basically fear of the future. This is rooted in the lack of capacity of the current economic model to distribute wealth generated in a fairer way. Clearly, the environmental issue for us is not something that belongs only to an elite. It's not that you can take care of the environment once you have enough wealth to take care of the environment. I think this has stopped being part of the language that we share, because we know that environmental damage affects first those who are most in need. This idea is still challenged today. People like the President of the United States justify withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, considering that basically the Paris Agreement goes against the possibilities of certain communities in the United States to have a better life. Or he openly says that fighting against climate change kills employment, taking us 25 years back, but at least in discourse, it takes us 25 years back in the idea that employment and the environment cannot go together. It is in this setting, which has its symbols now, like the President of the United States, but actually there is something deeper that we have to challenge. That's the work that with my friends here we have been doing over the last few years. We must try to prove that there is an alternative way to see this issue. We should not oppose social progress and environmental protection. We should try to address how to better protect the environment, also reaching social justice goals. It is not the issue whether we can afford to choose one goal or the other, because neither is feasible if they are not addressed consistently. So our contribution to that debate has been the concept of fair transition as a concept that helps us propose. This concept is also based on historical experiences, several experiences of transitions that very often have been fundamentally unfair. And if you take a look at the map of Europe of the mining regions of the vote of the far right, regrettably, they coincide. And they do not coincide because the people who lived out of mining are bad people. They coincide because the social transition and the investment made in those places very often was not enough to reconstruct the social bond that used to exist in those communities and which goes beyond employment itself, or beyond the fact that those people can receive an anticipated pension when the source of jobs is closed. So, going back to our issue, for us, a fair transition is a process over time, but it's also a way of thinking about public policy in an active way and with anticipation. One of the presenters in the first section said this: it is a matter of anticipating as a society the upcoming transformations and trying to propose to those people who we already know will be at the forefront of this transformation a feasible, nice, desirable alternative about the role that they will have in our society in the next few years. Although this seems to be terribly abstract, it has a very concrete tradition in public policy, even in countries like ours, Argentina, and it is feasible. But these public policies have a cost. They require making choices. That is, how we allocate the money. And very often, they are put in the last place in the train of policies. For us, this is related to planning investments, identifying the communities and territories that we know may be affected by the transition. In the case of energy, these are not just the workers of power stations, but also the communities of these power stations, because they are at the heart of their economic life. But we're also thinking about the transformation of the transportation sector. Very often, We think about energy when we talk about electricity, but we are also considering transportation in countries like ours, South America, with a transportation matrix that has gone away from being sustainable because of the lack of money to invest in sustainable infrastructure. It basically requires to be transformed as a whole. This means, first, that investment with employment, decent job options are required, that is, quality jobs. Basically, this means that workers have to feel that these are desirable jobs where they want to participate and make a living. But investments are not the only thing. Investments also mean giving a role to the state or to public agents in dynamizing those investments. They should not be just public money, but there should be regulations, norms, and fiscal policy, the topic that we will discuss today, to know how we will allocate those investments in a good way. But we must also consider new ways of social dialogue about these environmental issues. So far, very often, the dialogue mechanisms, when they exist, are confined to the capital cities, when actually this topic will have deep consequences in many territories. So we should rethink the ways that territories, communities, and different players, including, of course, the trade union movement, but also community actors, the different territory actors, people who have been chosen at that level, and companies, when they are present there, should be able to rethink those territories together. We are also talking about the need about professional training, training that is adjusted to the needs of the coming century. Professional training has been limited in general to proposing a course about something when very often these things do not enable the person to get a job, or those workers are not supported so that this new training may be interesting in a future labor market. However, professional training is not a magic solution either. We also need active policies, that is, employment market active policies. Workers should be supported so that this worker with very good training may get a job. I was unable to read before coming a study about some CONICET researchers that have evaluated the labor insertion policies in Argentina, and they have considered them as very innovative because they put together professional training and a program to support people, for those people who were part of the Heads of Home program. This shows a possibility in a country where active employment policies have not been developed. In general, in Latin America, it's a subcontinent where support for unemployed people is poorly developed. In most of our countries, there is no unemployment insurance. So this adds to the feeling of fear or insecurity, which causes many people to uphold the things that they know instead of taking a leap to the unknown when there is no network to sustain income for the necessary time to access new competencies and new knowledge.
That is partly what fair transition means, knowing that there is this territorial dimension, that we mean that every sector, every company, every transition, every space that must be transformed, and that basically must become an alternative single economic model, unique. I mean, especially the case about forestry, as was mentioned, it's a very special case, and I believe that the figures in terms of energy transformation on the forestry sector at world level, perhaps we're speaking about the same million people that today are living on sectors that are not sustainable. We are also losing species, And we know that there are sectors that are even much more vulnerable from the viewpoint of the workers who live off the land of this sector. And this made me reflect because a few years ago I came to the province of Formosa in Argentina, and the workers took me to see a project in the framework of decent work that had an environmental leg. And speaking with the workers in Formosa, many of them worked in wood cutting. I told them about this idea about transition, and there is this idea that the worker is a being that is selfish and only thinks about himself and doesn't think about international spheres or what this means for the planet. And perhaps the reason why I've been working so much with the unions is that this is so false. After the meeting in which I presented myself before these sawmill workers and they came to talk, and she said, we've been discussing this idea of fair transition here in Formosa because the proposal of the union was to the owner of the sawmill for it to be closed down. We proposed it should be closed down because we knew that the life expectancy was about 10 years. So the union's option was, now we are sure you're making lots of money, and what we want is that you finance this, that, and the other in our community, and this means new sources of employment. For us also, it will mean to have some sort of saving and not to wait for 10 years until you close down your doors and you kick us out. So this bravery, this act of bravery, because unions also work for people who many times may not get why we have made certain choices, that is to have long-term future vision. And this is the kind of people who need the support, and here is where I will stop. We need the support of people such as environmental organizations, such as institutions that today are thinking of a future of different countries. This is the people that need help, because I believe we don't need a list of virtues that the different social organizations must have in order to be part of an environmental plan. What we need is organizations such as yours that support the unions when they are right, when they are pushing in the right direction, especially that communities are supported that have decided to go for change and progress, but many times cannot see what the alternatives are, the tangible options that can give workers, these communities, a future. We are undergoing a special moment in which we can still choose the kind of economic model that we wish to build, and it will not last forever. And as I watch my kids, they're 4 years old and 7 months old, I feel that they will not be able to choose. Actually, they will not be able to choose what kind of world they will have unless now we make the necessary decisions. And that's what it's all about, to make the necessary decisions, but with the will in order to talk with the players who can tell us how can we do this so as to have environment removed from the elite and to have it at the core of social progress that we need to build. The fair transition idea is here, as many other ideas and concepts, in order to build social support that we need for environmental policies. So it is a tool, and we welcome new organizations to join this initiative, and that's why we believe that initiatives such as the one that Santiago and Tabari have led give hope about the possibilities that the environmentalist arena opens up, and to sit together to talk about these issues. So we are thrilled to have the possibility of continuing our joint work and conversations and fruitful deliberations, and hoping to continue working together in the future. So whether these advances are higher in some regions, or what does this depend on? It depends on the government, on the political situation. Can you tell us about this progress? In my viewpoint, there are two interesting ideas. One is a situation in which there is a government that is being very ambitious in terms of its emission reduction policies or economies, and when the objectives are presented, this has generated a certain turmoil in the unions that have took a stand, and they said, okay, if we have to go that way, this is what we propose. That's the case in Sweden, with a government that is very progressive. The president used to be a unionist, and this has meant that the unions have actually moved in this direction because they feel identified with him. So we must support him, but we must support him with our own ideas about how to do this in Sweden. So there is here a very interesting scenario, and also there is progress in other countries that perhaps are less ambitious, but you are opening up the dialogue with the unions. It is the case in Canada, in Germany, to a certain extent, with difficulties because the plans in Germany are very clear, especially in terms of carbon exit, and this leads to certain difficulties with the unions of coal, who still cannot see how the investments will take place in the regions that might be affected. So there is a positive conversation here. There's not great support by the citizenry here, and this also changes the debate. So in issues that are more about how can we do this feasible in a way that is fair to everyone. There are also interesting things happening in some developing countries such as the Philippines, where of course there are some peculiarities in terms of the government, or may I say president. The team who's working on environment is very progressive and is thinking about the situation such as we have in Latin America, trying to see what options there are in an emerging economy of million consumers who only wish to reproduce the middle class US dream for consumption, how to avoid this and head to a different model. And the union movement vindicates and demands the process that is taking place against multinationals in terms of oil, for instance. And the union in the Philippines is part of the plaintiffs in this process. And as I was saying, in countries in which the government wish to be part of the debate on transition, I see progress. But it's also interesting to see what's going on in the US, in which the government is going in the opposite direction. And this has opened up a place of opposition between organizations that may have never talked to one another, but perhaps now, with all that's happening in an administration that is trying to destroy practically everything from the work legislation or environmental legislation, this has also generated a place in which there is great solidarity and great deliberation. And I also think this is very interesting. It is actually very important to notice that for the first time in history, when Trump announces that he leaves the Paris Agreement, the main union confederation in the US that for about 10 or 15 years was together with Bush saying the climate will kill employment, for the first time said we want US to stay in the Paris Agreement, and we don't believe in the idea that climate change policies will kill employment. And the president of the Union of Industry, that is one of the biggest within this confederation, said Trump has this phrase, "Make America great again." And he said, no, what he wants is that America is toxic again. And again, relating this to what environmental regulations meant in order to protect the health of workers in the US for 30, 40 years. People were dying because of lead exposure, for instance. And many times we ignore this because we tend to think that it is in our countries where regulations are always the worst if we compare ourselves to developed countries, but this is not always the case. And in many cases, we are not doing so badly in terms of regulations, right? Then there is enforcement. That's another story. But there is progress, and as I said, there is progress. I also believe in terms of raising awareness more locally. The greatest challenge we face today is what's the plan? That is to say, we have our long term goals, national goals, but this doesn't translate into sectors or local locally, and what are the measures that will make these goals possible. And this makes it really hard for social organizations to take a stand, because they can say, yes, we agree with a certain goal, but if we don't know how we are going to fulfill it, if it's through regressive policies through the fiscal sector, for instance. So from one day to the next, what we're trying to do is lower taxes on employment, for instance, and have a VAT of 30%. And we know it's regressive for the consumer, and that's the way that the state can get money to do something else. I mean, there are perfect proposals and there are others that are not as good, and we know that the important thing lies on the how. This is where we need to grease the wheels with olive oil. In countries that have a clear policy in terms of carbon, as you said, Germany, what are the proposals that the unions make in terms of transformation of jobs? What are the concrete proposals? What does the union propose? What kind of jobs, what kind of sectors can be involved? In the case of Germany, and we're speaking about coal here, right? Because this is the important thing, and the greatest social transformation has already happened, and we're speaking about a country that had over 300,000 coal workers and now 20,000. So the thick of the transformation has already taken place, and in some cases in a way that's not so bad, but in a certain period that was longer. So the transition of traditional carbon happened perhaps in a 30-year span or 20-year span where there was heavy investment. And now we're speaking about a faster change, a much faster change, especially in developed countries. If we wish to follow the concept, I mean scientifically, of the 1.5 desired increase of temperature, such as the Paris Agreement stands. So first, coal must be done away with, but then a zero emission economy from here to 2050. We're speaking of 30 years. So the main concern, I believe, by the union of the energy sector in Germany is not so much in terms of the workers of the company, because most of them understand that these highly qualified workers will continue to work there and will get a good pension, as it happens in Germany. But the greater concern is on the territories, that because of their geography, their location, there are territories that used to belong to East Germany, so it also has some difficulties and also already feel excluded in the whole, I mean in Germany as a whole, and there are the experts who may chip in here with their opinions, but the great concern is what happens with the territories and with people who offer services, who sell sandwiches to workers. So they're not going to be reclassified by the company. That's a great concern. And for this, what they're asking is that some of the policies that were used in other parts of Germany be reproduced. And companies these days are saying, okay, well, but that's not our realm, it's the state who should do it. There is something in the co-management German model that indeed worked in this first transition, is that something that now companies are not wishing to contribute with the same level of financing, and they're waiting for the state to finance. And things, and it's a difficult moment for national budgets. It's hard to find the money in order to do this kind of reinvestment project, try to catch new investors, new infrastructure. And one of the options is also, it's a beautiful region with beautiful forests
la explotación minera y también hay mucha
are destroyed with the mining, and so there's a lot of work to be done with restoration, reestablishment, where there are possibilities of employment that might be taken advantage, but there must be people wishing to invest here. And so the greatest risk today for many of these companies is that the big companies now are accused of polluting and keeping the coal production, may sell to the best bidder, usually Polish or Czech companies, so that they finish it off, produce what's left, because then there's no social awareness, no responsibility about what happens in the territory. And what's interesting is that this is the worst possible scenario for the unions, and this means renegotiating all the collective agreements, losing many of the rights of the workers, and also there is an interest, especially in the case of Germany, to negotiate with the companies that exist now, the transition and basically the closing, much more than to pushing the issue so much that the companies will sell out. And this is happening actually with Vattenfall, for instance, a Swedish company that is exerting a lot of pressure in Sweden. So we don't want you to have any more coal, and this is the citizens saying this, and the company just sold out recently to a Polish company, so one of their facilities. So this is something that could happen. This is very dynamic, and it leaves the unions in a complex place. So I don't think there's a good guy or a bad guy. It's a tough situation. No one wants people to lose their jobs. They want people to live well. There's a song that someone told me the other day in Wales, General Secretary, also coal, heavily coal. There is a famous song that says, where there used to be a well, now there is a little supermarket. And that shows what the options are. So from a very prestigious work with an important social role, then the option is to work at a supermarket. And of course we respect the people who work at supermarket, but we know they are very low salaries, very few possibilities to evolve in the company. So we need to think about this social status and symbolic area that comes together with transformation.
Hola, sí.
Hello, my name is Pablo Rodriguez Somoza. I work with the union in Argentina called CGT, and I would like to ask you, taking into account this need of energy matrix change, taking into account that we still are heavily dependent on oil, apart from the fact that there are also other sources of energy, I would like to ask you if you can speak about a fair transition example in the region, in Latin America, that has been done well and that you can share with us. No. Actually, the public policy objectives that are trying to pursue these goals are not there yet. I cannot give a single example of a government in a region where the objectives have been met, in which we have said, okay, to fulfill these objectives, we need this transition. For the time being, we are working on this. This doesn't mean that it's impossible. And take the case of Costa Rica, very interesting case. They have this 100% renewable in short allocated time and space. And what they have observed for now is generation of employment. They used to depend a lot on their energy matrix. A lot of the fuel was imported, And for them, if they can get 100% renewable, it's win-win, right? Because they will not have the loss of currency in the international purchase of fossil fuels, and this energy is generated at home, and this generates jobs, of course. And especially in South America, where the energy matrix is more mixed and there is local energy generation and also exports, but the situation is more complex. We have our own workers, and in terms of electricity generation, energy generation, and although we need to generate more because most of our countries also have an issue of access that has to be covered, so we need to generate more energy to work, generate more power. And I read the paper given by Fundación Vida Silvestre a few months ago, the role provided to power efficiency is very important. But trying to answer your question, in our countries, until we are in the situation in which we can lose one job because of this transition, we are still far from it. What we will see is massive growth in the sector of sustainable employment. There might be obsolete facilities that will have to close down, but this has to do with life and reduction of emissions of the country. It is hard for me to see where we could lose employment in these 15 or to 20 years. I can see what we can create if investments are good. This doesn't mean ignoring the problem. If we manage to generate a lot in a decade, this can also help us to work in a more virtuous cycle, replacing the matrix of employment in the country.
To complete the question about the region, how do you view the proposal of Ecuador? Ecuador does not talk about energy but oil, among others, and the Amazonia. So I don't know if you want to make any reference to that when they go to Europe to propose a change about not taking oil from the soil. Clearly, my reaction is not official. It's unofficial because we don't have a position about Yasuni. It's difficult because the proposal from the beginning not operating this field because this is a loss to my country. So if you help me and you pay, I can do other things with that money, such as developing my country, and I don't need to operate the field. In principle, it's a very progressive idea. Now, when you see that basically the space that you wanted to preserve is 1/20th of the entire park, and the rest of the park had been given to oil companies, you can be doubtful about the actual will of preserving that area. Ultimately, perhaps because I come from a developing country, I think that the solution for us won't come with money from the north. The solution will come from our own capacity to reinvent our development model. And with all the knowledge, capacity, imagination, we can do that. I wouldn't count on the help of anyone because they won't give it to us. Because when the money is necessary, they will use it for those people who pay taxes in their own country, which is not wrong. Right now, in France, where I live, power stations will close. They have to change things. They also need money to transform them. And actually, they need more money than we do because in some aspects, we have not been captured in a certain infrastructure of the previous century. So perhaps the need for change is more expensive for them. And I'm not taking pity on them, but the citizen of a European country is a taxpayer and they want their country to work. And perhaps they are willing to have certain international solidarity, but I don't know to what extent they will be willing to finance the preservation of oil somewhere in the world. So I think that our salvation will come from a strong convergence of citizens putting pressure in favor of the right goals and in the right way to achieve them, and from leadership and vision from our politicians. So far, this has been lacking. And I am not talking about any specific country in the region. This is general. Obviously, please do not consider me an expert, because you are just as expert as I am. You can also provide your opinion, not just ask questions, and you can tell me that you disagree. I am Carlos Tanides from the Vida Silvestre Foundation. Annabella, one of the things that I think about when we start considering these things is the topic of the speed of the transition. This is a very pressing issue. It has its own dynamics. We cannot control it. So what would seem to be, or where should we start to achieve this transition operationally? What would be the mechanisms that you would recommend, or that you think have worked in the world, to activate this as soon as possible? Because there's no time. This is not something we can regulate. It has its own speed, and it's taking over. Clearly, change is going much faster, and basically in sectors where we did not expect that to be there like that. I'm following closely the issue of transportation, particularly the issue of electric cars. For a long time, we thought this was a marginal issue. Even environmentalist organizations, we thought it was a bad replacement of the combustion engine and public transportation. You may agree, but today in Paris, the possibility to regulate diesel cars has caused the market price of a used diesel car to go down from 200%. That is, there is no more market for a diesel car in Paris today. Nobody wants to buy that kind of car. This has an enormous impact on the automotive industry, which in France continues to build these cars, on the resales market, and this has happened in 3 years. And nobody saw that coming. So I fully agree on the speed. What can we do in concrete terms? I believe in dialogue, and I believe that we need institutionalized mechanisms. That is, mechanisms that will confirm who the parties to the debate are. A little bit like what was invented in Spain when there was a government interested in environmental issues. They had these boards of different sectors, different players participated on those boards. So the employers participated, and they said, we will lose hundreds of jobs. And you ask them, show me exactly what you will lose. And actually there were 2 jobs. So we should have different sectors at the table to see how we advance this. The environmental organizations should be there, but we should start having an institutionalized form of dialogue about these issues, because nowadays our dialogue forms, at least in Latin America, are only about wages, in the case of trade unions, a little bit about working conditions, but they are increasingly fewer, because the spaces to have a debate about working conditions apart from wages, given the same dynamics of the economy, have been marginalized. But also environmentalist organizations, they are consulted only before a document is submitted to an international meeting, or when there is a framework debate on a certain policy. I think that we have to demand space for decisions, which is much more important. And since we are together and we want that space to meet, I think that this can create a faster dynamics to execute policies. And another form is social pressure. I think that we must not continue thinking that this issue will be solved thanks to the goodwill of some people who know a lot about it, and which governments do not do because they don't know. Actually, they know exactly what they have to do. Others many of them. Others may not be so knowledgeable, but there is not a critical mass of people who are demanding a change. And that's our job, to cause people to feel that change belongs to them and that they need it. And that's what we are missing. That's the heart of any kind of public demand.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to move on to a panel with the participation. I will introduce them now. The goal is based on something that was mentioned by Annabella. Public policies are required that anticipated effects, and they can only function if they are supported by fiscal measures, whether by budget to finance activities or by a fiscal framework which may persuade investments so that they will be targeted to the desired objectives. The topic can be discussed at length. We have a limited time, but we have a great set of specialists. We will start with Kai Schlegelschmidt, who will give his talk remotely. You have heard his voice already. He's in Berlin. He was unable to come, but fortunately, thanks to information technologies, he will participate. He belongs to a think tank called Green Budget Europe. For many years, it has worked on promoting environmental fiscal reform. Now they work particularly in issues of climate change, but they work with the entire set of environmental fiscal reforms. Then Marcos Mancini, country manager for Argentina of the UNEP inquiry. This is the United Nations Environment Program initiative that promotes the change of the financial architecture for sustainability. We also have Christoph Ernst, a specialist in employment and productive development from the ILO. He works in Argentina in green jobs, but also in supply chains, which will be the topic of panel 2. And we also have with us Eduardo Alatorre, Economic Affairs Officer of the Climate Change Unit of the Economic Committee for Latin America of the United Nations. For many years, it has been participating with the governments of the region in the design of paths towards low-carbon societies. So I will now introduce the topic. Annabella gave a long talk. We are at the crossroads. And the energy transition is no doubt unstoppable. Most conservative estimates of the International Energy Agency suggest that for 2050, at least half of the energy produced in the world will come from renewable sources. That's a very conservative estimate. Other estimates say that this will be more. In WWF, we say that by 2050, 100% of energy sources will be renewable. We think that technically it is possible. Economically, there are certain barriers that we need to overcome, but there is time for that, and we think it's possible. What does this involve? This involves a technological breakthrough. We are going through a technological change, as other technological changes have occurred. There is a concept in economy called destructive creation, which is the appearance of new technologies which make the previous ones obsolete. This causes economic damages for a certain way of doing things, but those who break through do so strongly, and they establish a new economic dynamics. This concept has been part of our lives. We have seen how landlines disappeared because of mobile phones. That's creative destruction. But telegraphs replaced telephones, then trains with highways. There have been many changes. The electric machines replaced steam engine, so that has always existed. Now we are witnessing another technological change. The difference is that we think that we are rational human beings and that we learn from experience. So we should be able to foresee the negative impacts and discuss them among us to generate agreements so that new creative destruction will not have so many negative impacts. That's what this is about, to give rise to the adequate social and political dialogue to make this transition in the best way. As I was saying, the energy transition is coming, but given climate issues, many social actors and governments are committed to accelerating this transition. The effects of climate change, if we observe this transition for some time, if we wait, we are running risks, and these risks have a high cost for society. That's why it's important to promote a social agreement for an orderly transition. And this should happen as soon as possible. We should create the conditions and the way to reach these agreements in the best possible way. Today, Jan Rodman, who presented this a couple of years ago, says that this is a time of chaos. We are here in this intermediate stripe where we have not moved on to clean energies yet, but we are shifting towards them. It is chaos because those who have the factual power will not let go, and those who are more dynamic still don't have the capacity, but the technology and the anticipation of well-being of low-carbon energies give them spaces to develop. We have a blurry map of the coexistence of both times. In that regard, at a time of chaos, only that who is more adjustable to change will survive, not the strongest one. And that depends on how able we are to foresee that future and how we can get ready for it. When it comes to the role of government, because we will discuss fiscal policies, obviously, in a transition situation with a certain chaos, the common goods should prevail. The common goods should prevail. And the formal representative of the common good is the government. It hasn't been always like that, obviously. It has been so exceptionally. But the government has a key role in facilitating this transition so that it will be simple. In financial and fiscal terms, there is something important. You may know the case of the G20. 2 years ago, they commissioned the Financial Stability Board to review whether the impact of climate change generated a systemic risk for financial stability. It has been seen that it does. There is a possibility of a perfect storm. If the transition or impact risks accumulate in a short time, these will lead the financial system to lack the capacity to readjust to such an extreme event. So the world of finance is much more aware that climate change does represent a risk. It has been very illustrative that the director of the IMF, Christian Lagarde, and King director of the World Bank, Angel Gurria, director of the OECD, all of these economic organizations put climate change at the top of the risks for the world economy. That is, the topic is already in the financial world. And so, from the point of view of a government in a transition, taking a look at what's going to happen in fiscal terms is important and critical. Some governments are already doing it, and we are going to talk a little about that. We come. This is just a proposal about how we can start thinking about them. We come from a fiscal policy where fossil fuels still receive enormous subsidies, absurd subsidies. Many of them, some of them are subsidies to consumption, but some subsidies are to production. That is, exploration is subsidized, even if it is known that according to several carbon tracker calculations, about 3/4 of proven reserves should stay in the subsoil if we want to reach our goal not to exceed 2 degrees of global warming, or if we want to achieve the 1.5 goal. And governments continue to explore and promote oil exploration, that is, increasing reserves to have more actives which are a potential disaster for the financial system. There are also taxes which belong to the era of fossil fuels. They can be changed. The fiscal system is not neutral. So we see that one way to face the issue would be an environmental fiscal reform. That is, incorporating the costs of externalities, which are usually social costs, that the government has to address, or they have an impact on society and the environment. The price of coal is also is a heated debate globally, but has not provided any results yet. So there are options, but we need knowledge. An important part of what Annabella was saying is that if we are thinking that the most vulnerable communities in this transition should not be left behind, this will require improving the social security network system, specifically in certain regions of the country. This requires resources. How will this be financed? If we leave an old to a new taxation model, some risks are involved, and at this time, resources are needed for this social security network and to increase or provide incentives for activities that have not matured yet, not adequately to develop the value chains that represent the technology of the future. This can put additional stress on the already difficult public finances in developing countries. So the idea is to explore the questions raised about how this transition can be conducted. What is the role of fiscal policy? What are the bottlenecks? And to go deeper into these ideas. I doubt that we will leave this room with a solution, but the idea is to gain a better understanding of that role. So here we might start with Kai's presentation. He is at a distance. We hope that the equipment will function correctly, and let's hope the presentation will be successful. Kai, We will start in a few moments. Kai, the floor is yours. You can start with the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you a bit better. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Muchas gracias, Santiago. Perdón, pero yo no hablo.
I'm sorry, but I don't speak Spanish. I speak English. Thank you very much.
I would like to give a presentation, and I'm very honored that this is possible, and I hope you understand me, on the fiscal policies for a just energy transition. And I will present you some lessons learned from Europe and Asia. Can you understand me good?
Yes, yes.
So I will continue. So second slide, please. I will first introduce you with some European climate and energy policies, and then continue with more tax-specific issues. Now, on the EU level, in the European Union, we have followed a strategy which is target setting, implementation, and monitoring. So we set targets for energy and climate issues until 2020. You see them, we cut emissions by 20%. We want to improve the energy efficiency by 20% and have a share of renewables of 20% by 2020. We have increased these targets until 2030 and 2050 so that we will have an almost carbon-free society by 2050. And in the Europe 2020 strategy, it is explicitly mentioned that one major pillar for that is an environmental tax reform, a tax shift to achieve that. Now coming to the German case, you can see on the next slide the specific targets for the energy concept in Germany. And you see it is built on three pillars. One is the climate-related targets, and you see they go down until 2050, where we reach 80 to 95% greenhouse gas emission reduction. Then the second pillar is renewable energies, and there the share will increase up to 80% in terms of electricity. Now we have already achieved more than 35% in this year, so we exceed the target which you see here of 35%. And the third pillar is increasing the energy efficiency. All the three go together because they are directly linked to each other. The more you increase the efficiency, the less ambitious you have to be with the renewable energy targets, or the easier they are to achieve. So it's very important to follow all these pillars jointly and not leave out one. Next slide, please. The most important instrument to achieve renewable energy targets in the electricity sector is the so-called Renewable Energy Sources Act. This is a feed-in tariff which provides a perfect investment certainty for 20 years' time. So in the law, we put a priority connection for grid systems and transmissions of renewable energies. All the costs for the connection have to be borne by the plant owner, or grid extensions costs have to be borne by the grid owner. The feed-in tariff is guaranteed for 20 years' time, and the different plants are favored by this feed-in tariff depending on what technology and where they are installed. So they try to take into account exactly the costs of these renewable energies. And all this together gives really a perfect investment certainty, and this explains why Germany has been so successful in achieving its renewable energy targets. Next slide, please. There are clear benefits for that policy in Germany. We did an evaluation more than 10 years ago already, where we clearly found that we save a lot of imports, which means a lot of saved billions. We also save a lot of CO2 emissions, which we can then sell on the emissions trading system in Germany, in Europe. And we have the so-called merit order effect, which saves another 3 to 5 billion euros. And overall, renewables created up to 300,000 additional jobs. So this is really a win-win solution and brings more people into jobs. So this has become very attractive to policymakers. Next slide, please. Not at least because the local communities benefit a lot from these policies. You see the economic relevance of local corporation tax revenues in the last 10 years in northern Germany, where we have a lot of wind power. The communes get part of that local corporation tax, and therefore they have an incentive to provide more land for wind power, for solar power, and therefore they have a direct benefit in terms of cash flow into their pockets. And this makes it very attractive. This makes me move on to, next slide please, to the general issue of budget and tax policies. There's a general saying that budget and tax policies tell the truth about your real priorities, not political proclamations you do on Sundays. I said, tell me what you tax and what you spend, and also what you do not tax and don't spend. And I will tell you what your true objectives are. Next slide. It is very much about that you tax what you burn and not what you earn. This means tax bads and not goods. This comprises this environmental fiscal reform, consisting of two elements. One is the environmental tax reform, and the second one is a subsidy reform. Next slide, please. This is about internalizing externalities into the polluter's calculation. So the hidden costs of environmental pollution are to be taken into account by the polluters. He has to pay, and therefore it is taken into its calculation. That's the intention of subsidy reform and environmental fiscal reform. Next slide, please. Let me inform you about some experiences with environmental taxes in Europe. We have major energy and carbon taxes in Europe, basically transport fuels. They are the core elements of environmental tax and fiscal reform in Europe. Not at least because they provide the largest revenues from all taxes, all environmental taxes. And this enables policymakers also to make a tax shift. So they increase energy taxes on the one hand, but they decrease other taxes on the other hand. So you can reduce taxes which are more distorting, like taxes on value added or on income taxes. They can be reduced, or social security contributions can be reduced. And the social aspects are taken into account by the choice of the tax base. So maybe you can introduce an air ticket tax on flights. There, it's basically high-income people, rich people being affected by that tax, but not poor people. So the tax base is already very important to see what impact has it on the social agenda. You can think about reduced rates or increasing social welfare paid by the revenues of the income from eco-taxes. The size of the tax shift is often up to 5% of total tax revenues, which is about 2% of gross domestic product, GDP. Mostly there are slightly positive impacts on energy consumption, economic growth, and jobs occur. And once these eco-taxes have been introduced, then often policymakers find it makes also sense to reduce environmentally harmful subsidies. So this topic is tackled then as well. Next slide. You see that there are several environmental fiscal reforms elements which policymakers can choose from. It's taxes, it's subsidies, it's fees and charges, it can be border tax adjustment, but also emission allowances or trade permits. Next slide. Let me give you a brief overview of European countries which have implemented such tax reforms. You see three categories of countries. One is those which I would classify as comprehensive eco-tax reformers, which are Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, United Kingdom, and Estonia. So basically the Nordic countries, they have already introduced such taxes back in the 90s and increased those taxes over the time. Then there are other countries which have introduced elements of an ETR: Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Ireland, and also some countries which have just tested it with some modest elements, like Austria, Belgium, and Slovenia. But overall, what we see is that many countries have tested it and have gathered a lot of experiences with these taxes. Let me give you one concrete example, which is Germany. There, in 1999 already, an eco-tax reform was introduced. There was a steady increase and broadening of energy taxes in 5 small steps, and on the other hand, a steady decrease of social security contributions to the pensions fund, and even some environmental protection programs were financed. What were the impacts? The CO2 emissions were reduced by 2 to 3%, and additional 250,000 jobs were created in the energy efficiency and renewable energy sector. So this was a major success of that reform. And then from 2005 on, we also reduced environmentally harmful subsidies, and we introduced a road pricing for lorries. In 2011, another step was taken: an air ticket tax and a nuclear fuel tax was introduced. Now, let me give you an overview of the impacts on several countries that have been introducing such taxes. You see on the next slide the chart that there were only positive impacts on GDP and job growth from these eco-tax reforms in the various countries. On the other hand, the CO2 emissions were reduced the same as the GDP growth was increased. So overall, this was very attractive because a double dividend was achieved. Next slide, you see a nice green picture of all EU countries where they introduced a lot of green taxes. You see on the left hand that about 25 different tax bases can be chosen, but you see just about 10 countries here, because it would be too much to present all countries, which have taken several steps in several years. The main messages here: you witness a lot of EU creativity, so there are many roads to Brussels and a lot of autonomy from neighbors, but there are similar situations in new member states in the EU. Next slide. I would not only talk about... Yes? Yes? Yes, okay. So we jump Asia. I'd like just to stress that the abolition of environmentally harmful subsidies is very important too, because these subsidies, they depress growth, they exert pressure on the balance of payments of energy importers, they endanger the fiscal balance of the budget in Argentina and other countries, and they create negative externalities. And even worse, they reinforce inequality, because the poor are suffering most from these subsidies. Next slide, you see that the abolition of energy subsidies and road fuel taxation would be very progressive. So it really makes sense also for social issues to introduce such reforms. Next slide, green budgeting. This is for the finance ministry a very interesting process how to mainstream their national budgets. I will skip the first slide so we can jump to the second one. You see the impacts because the Ministry of Finance can check the entire budget whether it will help them to support green growth and economic strategy and to see which subsidies are harmful for their budget and which incentives are harmful for the environment. And they will also identify tax increases that may be possible. So overall, in a nutshell, there may be large fiscal resources generated, which is attractive to the finance ministry. Also, for the social compensation, it is important to increase the acceptance of such reforms. One little example is the subsidy report in Germany, where we check all subsidies every second year regarding their sustainability. We still need to come to a conclusion to implement some of the abolition of subsidies. Here on the next slide, you see this policy cycle as a toolbox which could be easily applied also in Argentina and Latin America. It starts with planning, with different tools of implementation, then you do some monitoring, see what are the impacts, and you start the cycle again. Moving to the third last slide, how to improve the communication of environmental fiscal reform. It's very important to have a clear vision and a political leadership by the government to communicate correctly and facilitate the change by promoting alternatives. For example, having tax reductions or promoting certain technological alternatives, particularly for those who are vulnerable and who cannot afford high-priced technologies. And you need to make a business case for the enterprises to demonstrate that the energy turnaround is profitable for them, and this will create jobs and also income for people who are jobless so far. Second last slide, there are good experiences with these eco-tax reforms, like these elements, like differentiation of taxation, because then you have a higher tax for environmentally harmful commodities, whereas you can reduce the tax for environmentally friendly technologies, and therefore you have a very strong incentive. For islands, it's very good to have public transport and transport fuel at a high level because people cannot really have an alternative there. And for many countries, it has turned out to be profitable to have an air ticket tax because this would clearly have positive impact on the social issue. Phasing out reduced tax rates and complete exemptions are also another opportunity. And as I said before, the subsidy reporting can be a very good means to have a regular process. That is all from my side. If you are interested in other issues apart from that energy issue, we have a nice study on waste management sector in Latin America. You see the links on the last slide. Muchas gracias for your attention, and I'm ready to take your questions, but please in English. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Now we will give the floor to Eduardo. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It is quite a pleasure for me to be here. I will be brief, or at least I shall try. First, actually, can I have first? The necessary reduction of emissions in order to prevent the most catastrophic effects of climate change entail a change at international level in the way in which we consume goods and services. This kind of change is in turn a structural change of our energy and production matrix that is only comparable to industrial revolution experienced in the past, with the differentiating factor that now the change must be deliberate and targeted, and therefore it calls for the use and application of public policies at massive and coordinated level. Also a level of involvement of the citizenry at a massive level. Next one, please. In order to discuss this, I would like to mention the consumption patterns in Latin America, the relation with energy consumption, and what options are presented in a fiscal policy. As you very well know, the growth of the region was sustainable, which helped us to achieve certain goals such as poverty reduction and improvement of the wealth distribution, and also greater access to basic goods and services. However, this growth, next one please, also is related to clearly the fact that there has been an increase in energy consumption. This can be explained by consumption patterns of the homes of the region that, as you will see, the public policies that we have had, or the lack of them rather, in the region have generated that certain activities are preponderant on others. Now, in order to see consumption patterns of the region, we can see that if we think of income quintiles in terms of dividing the population, having the first group of the lowest income and the fifth largest income, we can view that the more income, the less is spent on food. So if in the region our income has increased, so we don't need to spend so much on food, we open a scope of consumption, and that is shown in the next slide. And we need to see what we are spending on in this new area of consumption, and the way in which we use this area of consumption is good in terms of sustainability. So where is this consumption going? This is a graph done by Argentina, and this is something that can be also seen in the region. And the dramatic increases are significant in terms of the lowest GDP per capita. There's a migration from public transport into private, or public health into private health, and the same for education. What we have observed here is that these new emerging groups of populations can see that public goods do not meet people's expectations, and therefore they are migrating to private goods, and there are harmful effects related to the environment. For instance, public transport generates more contamination, more health problems, also greenhouse emissions, and also there is more traffic. So time to get to your job increases as well. This is reflected on the consumption of fuel, as was presented before me. And there are three things I would like to highlight here. One is that it increases in parallel to your income. So when your income increases 1%, also the fuel consumption increases by 1%. This is a highly concentrated good, and as you can see on the red dots, they show the concentration of the fuel consumption. The highest one is for Colombia, 2007, and the fifth quintile, the one with the greatest income, consumes 80% of the expenditure on fuel. So this is a concentrated good. So the wealthiest are the one that spend more on fuel, and also in countries in which they are subsidies, of course, they are the ones that receive the subsidy, the benefits of the subsidy. And a third characteristic that I like to point out, and again it comes from our estimations, is that the increases in fuel don't generate a real change in demand. And this related to the fact that there is a lack of substitutes in the region, such as could be the public transport, as is in Europe. If you've been to the US as well, you'll see that the price of gas, they can migrate to public transport easily in order to be better off. In Latin America, this is not the case. What we can see is quality, safety, coverage. They are not satisfactory. And although you might take this price of gas, you still use it, even if it's higher. In the case of Argentina, the concentration of consumption of fuel in Argentina divided into 10 income groups, and you can see that about 40% of the consumption and the lowest income, less than 10%, 1 to 3 or something like that. And the next one, please. And this opens up option of fiscal policies. One, if we know that we're going to continue to grow, we know that the demand for fuel will continue to increase as well. So to levy a tax to a good that is as concentrated as is the case of fuel consumption usually is not regressive in terms of direct impact. Another issue that is related is that it's not as sensitive in terms of change in the price not affecting the demand for the product. We can improve the infrastructure of public transport, for instance, which can contain social and environmental benefits. And also, it could be beneficial in terms of the income levels of the population. For instance, it wouldn't be necessarily a Keynesian policy. And this is a Lorentz curve that explains how concentrated the consumption of a certain income is. Total expenditure is the blue line, and we can see that the green line is the fuel consumption, that is the highly concentrated, mostly concentrated, given that public transport is better distributed in the country. That's the purple line. So I allocated resources from one into the other, which can benefit the population. Also, this shows that one tax on fuel is not enough for environmental improvement, because we will continue to use it. So we must have a package of measures, for instance, public transport or regulations that don't incentivize as much private transport. And of course, we must consider that every country is different. These are not measures that can be generalized in all countries, depends on the context. Also, countries such as the US, in which the poorest quintiles have a car, the measure then would be regressive. Or also the case of the electrical sector, in which the consumption is better distributed, an tax on this sector would be more regressive. Now, a tax on fuel is something that can be explored. It could be very positive. Thank you so much. Now, we will try to upload this information on the network. And I'm saying we will try because sometimes things are hard. But we will then move on to Christoph, and hopefully he can shed some light on the experiences in terms of what has been fiscal issues, public spending, and the green employment and the consolidation or boost on the productive change to generate this kind of employment is key. Christoph, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. I will try to be brief. I don't have a presentation. I think that the idea of a panel is also to have a debate with you. A long time has gone by. This is from a course that we did last week. There was a workshop on productive development. This change towards green economy, towards a different energy matrix, is a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift from consumption to production. And I would like to thank the previous presenters because they also highlighted the issue of consumption, because very often it is neglected. But consumption generates production. The challenge is to combine the economic targets of a country, its environmental and social goals. Very often this doesn't work. It seems evident, but sometimes it's chaotic and it goes astray, as it has been seen with some examples. So the challenge is to combine the three elements. Here we are discussing fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is not neutral. It has an impact. It has an economic, environmental, and social impact. The idea is to see how to design a fiscal policy that may help us have a win-win situation for the three elements. I wanted to give one example, and then I will stop. The example is related to the oil subsidies, which many countries use. It's just the ILO. In the ILO, with other organizations, we are against these subsidies because they cause environmental damage. They can uphold the economy in a certain way and they can create some jobs. So we have to see that the environmental impact is negative. So we eliminate the subsidy to change to renewable energies. This energy can later create more interesting jobs. It was observed that employment in renewable energies is more labor intensive, so the net impact is positive. We must also consider what happens with those people who lose oil-related jobs. There is also a production chain to be considered. But we must think of what we do with consumers. This has an impact on those people who use public transportation because prices rise. Transportation causes a price increase in basic staples, in food, that the marginalized and the poorest population eats. So this has to be compensated. We have to compensate for this loss, this price increase, with another policy. We must strike a balance between using the money saved due to abandoning the subsidy with social protection policies, as in Indonesia, Jordan, Egypt, in the south of Asia. The social protection policy has to compensate for this. But related to what Santiago said, there has to be a social protection network, but there has to be a universal social protection system, because the problem of a network, as you know, is that nets have holes and some people are left behind, out of the network. So there has to be a floor of social protection. I want to highlight two things in this regard. The change process is important because this paradigm shift is for a fair transition. This is a process and it has to be well designed so that it may be successful. We must clearly understand what the consequences are of fiscal changes. We must conduct an adequate analysis and we must have a good social dialogue with all the players that may be affected by this process in order to design the right policies and not having to adjust later when the damage has already been done. We must be aware of the right time. Sometimes we have already seen that very often abandoning a subsidy without creating a social protection system has effects, immediate effects. You could feel the negative effects immediately, but not the positive ones. So it's also important to consider about the time sequence of the reforms. That's why the process is very important. This is some food for thought. I would like you to talk more and make questions to engage in debate. Thank you very much. So, now Marcus, please. Thank you very much, Santiago. My viewpoint is a bit different. I come from the financial sector. In Quarry, actually, as Santiago said, works in the architecture of financial systems. We work with regulators. For example, we have worked with the United Kingdom Bank, designing scenarios of climate change, stress tests, and working on how climate change may affect the financial system. Another example is China. As you know, China has big air contamination problems. 4 million people die every year due to respiratory problems. So China's People's Bank conducted a stress test of its portfolios regarding air problems, how air contamination affected companies and different industries. Why do I think that this perspective is interesting? Everyone talked about scenarios. We must reach a 2-degree scenario, 1.5 degrees ideally. We also know that the investments required to reach these scenarios in a green economy will not come from the public sector. In Latin America, if we take a look, nowadays, investments in infrastructure, at least in Argentina, 77% come from the public sector. The rest come from the private sector. But in the national accounts, capital investment is more or less 15% in all of Latin America. Many studies are showing already that the investments required to reach a green economy will have to come from the private sector by 80%. So what is our theory of change that I want to propose, and then we can discuss? The fiscal policies that we have been discussing are fiscal policies that affect the real economy. There is a carbon market. So you put a price on externalities. Today, we know that if we monetize all of the externalities, the cost of earnings before taxes is 42 cents per each dollar earned. All of these measures are useful, but as Annabelle was saying, I think, regulation is not the problem. The problem is also the fiscal policy. So if we are thinking about more stringent control policies, the problem is how we monitor these control policies. So the theory of change that we use is what happens if instead of creating a tax here, we work on the financial system and we try to prevent the financial system from distributing capital to a certain sector. To give you an extreme example, what if today, in any financial system in Latin America, a policy is implemented against deforestation. That is, banks are prohibited from financing deforestation. Probably, deforestation will not disappear, but it will be certainly be reduced. So, through the financial system, it's possible to work in the redistribution of capital towards cleaner sources. Assessing the risks correctly, assessing the risks associated to physical risks, as Santiago was saying, or transition risks that may be involved in the fiscal policies associated to the real economy. So, if in the real economy we have a fiscal plan, a green fiscal plan like the one presented by Kai, and we have long-term plans, obviously, the financial sector will conduct the necessary analysis and will conclude that if I tax fuel, and I have two industries which are energy intensive, fuel intensive, but one of them has implemented greater efficiency ideas, that industry will be more competitive as compared to the other one. So, in the eyes of an investor, it will probably get more investments. I would like to mention, since we are talking about a fair transition, and in order not to make my talk longer, yesterday we were talking about the role of trade unions. And I think that trade unions have a key role in Latin America. Because all of us, as individuals in society, contribute with taxes which go to our pension funds. So, as individuals, we must also challenge how our taxes are being used, because they will be eventually our retirement. But today's investments are creating the conditions of tomorrow, the conditions in which we will retire. So we should think of how we would like that future to be like. Thank you very much, Marcos. I agree with the fact that the idea was to have some more debate among us and with you. So there is no more time for presentations. We will now entertain your questions, if there are any specific ones. The debate must continue, but we will do it under another platform because we are pressed for time. Are there any questions for any of the presenters, both for those present here, for Christoph, Eduardo, Marcos, or for Kai? Are there any thoughts that you would like to share?
We're waiting for the mic for the questions. Good morning. My name is Pablo. I'm coordinator of Business and Environment of Fundación Vida Silvestre Argentina. It's a comment rather than a question. In the case of Argentina, at least, given that the World Economic Forum placed Argentina 135 out of 136 in terms of taxes, the point is, how can we have a transition from a tax system that has been adjusting and has become stronger in terms of the whole industry? How can we do this, trying to include tax benefits? And part of the answer, I think, is to have a comprehensive reform. Unless we do this, it will be hard for us to think about taxes that punish going against green and a framework such as I am mentioning.
Sí, y es un tema apasionante, ¿eh? O sea que
It's quite interesting, actually. It's always interesting to see the presentations on people who work on green fiscalizations, because it's perfect in an ideal world, but when some government tries to do something about it at a fiscal level, apparently no one wants to pay any more taxes, perhaps because of what Jose was saying. More and more, the middle class is transferring to private services and rejects the idea of paying for the public services that they don't use, which makes public services be at a fragile point. I have two questions or comments. One of the difficult situations or scenarios for Latin America continues to be the informal economy that is quite large. So tax pressure is concentrated on a relatively reduced group, depending on what country we're talking about, of players in the economic life. And also, given that employment is informal, also we have a fiscal basis and a contribution that is not representative of those who will in the future need pensions. Now, sustainability of the pension system is one of the greatest barriers, perhaps, in order to support green fiscal systems. Because this idea that you can lower taxes on labor and increase them on natural resources generates a contradiction, because natural resources fiscal situation should go down, change the behavior of actors so that then the environment is protected. We don't want people to keep consuming and paying more in terms of natural resources, whereas the pension system at least should become stable. That is to say, those that are working finance the pensioners. So I'd like to know if you can give us any guidelines in this regard, because at least for us, it continues to be a very, very difficult issue. And to work on informality of labor, that is to say, make labor more formal, and not to see this as a contradiction. We will continue to need pension plans coming from work, and we will need also a comprehensive reform allowing for the balance, taking into account the key role of fiscal aspect in the social policy. Also, redistribution of wealth should be one, and this should still have an important role.
¿Quién? ¿Ana? Aquí primero.
Sí, buenos días.
Good morning. Raúl Andaveri, Fundación Bariloche is my organization. And to speak about subsidies, and in particularly hydrocarbon sector, is controversial, to say the least of it, or polemic. What's the fair price? We know that given the neoclassical scheme, prices don't reflect costs necessarily. That on the one hand, but on the other hand, regarding what has been said, it is necessary to defend and boost renewable energies and energy efficiency, and we see that they can be feasible in developed countries. However, I wonder if it can be 100% renewable, not so much because of economic reasons, but because of technical issues from production and from consumption aspects. But let's say underdeveloped countries, or whatever we wish to call them, in order to be developed, don't we need to have energy in quantity and quality and for low costs in order to be developed, to become developed, not at the developed countries level whose emissions are still in the air, but surely we won't need the levels of energy intensity that they have used decades ago, and we might develop with lower intensities. But I think this is a trade-off, and we are aiming for the win-win system. The development of the peoples and equity goes hand in hand with not so much emphasis exclusively on environment. So we need to combine and prioritize both aspects of the development of countries. Right. We might answer these and then have a last round of questions. Regarding the subsidy of hydrocarbons, can you react on this, on the price, the amount, as was mentioned? Yeah, there are different studies that can be mentioned. We published one in the case of Ecuador, Mexico, and El Salvador. We tried to see how many cents per liter, considering external factors, had to be included so that gas in that case had a fair price. And I can't recall the number now. I think 77 cents, though that may not speak to you. But it is a challenge in terms of prices, because as a policymaker, you want a price that is low for energy so that everyone can have access to energy. But for companies and developers of technology, you want a high price so that the new technologies are developed and can be used. So this is one of the greatest challenges, to find the fair price.
Lo tuyo, Anabela, Christoph.
Christoph? In the case of Argentina, I think it's important to have a comprehensive reform of the fiscal system, and in many cases, environmental fiscal reforms occur in a broader framework. I believe there are two elements to be considered. One, the fiscal efficiency in Argentina that should increase to view the fiscal scape as it relates to politics. There are many possibilities to increase this space. I don't think we should be negative in this respect. Not necessarily is this an issue of having greater taxes or increasing them. Rather than this, it is about changing the distribution of taxes, a change in order to tax actions that damage the environment. We can mention several examples. For instance, the case of Germany is quite interesting. There is this tax that is then later used in order to have money in the pension fund. This has effects on work and social effects, that this tax is used also to promote renewable energies, for instance. So it's not just about increasing the tax, but rather than this, changing the structure of taxes and how they are used. Also, the efficiency of public expense. There is greater acceptance if the public expense is efficient as well, and also a social impact. So, a social pact, solidarity amongst the different generations of people. That is why the pension fund works, that the youth pays for the elderly, waiting for the same to happen to them. And also, in terms of this, it happens at different levels of society. It's important to respect this social solidarity pact and not destroy it through tax reforms. A second round of questions. Two questions. One, I haven't yet heard much about a carbon tax, that is to have a tax for carbon at an international level. This is one of the elements in the Paris Agreement. I personally think that this could be very dangerous in many countries, but at social level it could be regressive. That's what I mean. But I haven't seen any study about this. I'd like to know your opinion. And a specific question that I had for Eduardo, I think it's interesting that about that study, you increase income as income increases, the consumption for food goes down, creating another spending opportunity. Have you discussed what impact this has on employment? Because it would be interesting to have its social effect analyzed apart from its economic effect analyzed. So apart from moving from public to private, can we consider other aspects? Taxes, for instance? I have a question on the problem of depending on the transition to a greener economy. Most technologies that were mentioned are not Argentine but foreign. Also, the most efficient vehicles are exported, and we have other sources of finances that are imported rather. How can we have a green economy without depending on transfer in other countries where these technologies are developed?
So the question is also about taxation. Argentina, in particular, citizens oppose taxes because their usefulness is dubious, especially the cost that is involved in paying taxes. There is, if you take a look at the fuel invoice, it says environmental tax, and you don't know how these funds are used. So the question is, are there any examples in any countries in the region or the world where there is a more democratic or more transparent process in the use of specific taxes? And if so, is it possible to translate this experience into other countries, maybe towards a mechanism to democratize the taxation system? So we will close this round. One more question. I think that this will be the last question because we were already behind the schedule. Good morning. My name is Carlos Ferreira. I wanted to make two comments. I have not heard in the panel any aspects of co-benefits of the development of a process of transition towards the green economy. There was a comment about this health situation in Mexico. But the key point that must differentiate us is the great battle now in the world against this transition process. The role of interests have a role in this. We can advance in raising theories and hypotheses about changes, tax policies, but the budget of fossil fuels companies for marketing makes it impossible in the developed world. Trump, for example, is now stopping this process. And what is happening in poor countries? The presence of the fossil fuels industry in Argentina, for example, is impressive in terms of the knowledge they manage. So I would like to know the board's opinion about these co-benefits and about the possibility and impossibility given the interests involved in this transition process. So, regarding the carbon tax, actually, there is no study about the global carbon tax, although there have been experiences in the region. For example, Mexico and Chile. They already have a carbon tax. Several countries are studying this alternative. Of course, this needs to be explored on a case-by-case basis. The expense and production structure need to be analyzed to know the impacts of a carbon tax on the economies. And regarding employment, we have not worked on it, but that would be a great idea for a joint work. About the role of foreign finance. I think that we are starting to discuss something now, which is the role of investment agencies. It's true. A great part of the infrastructure financing for Latin America will have to come from abroad. Many countries have created investment agencies to attract these investments. Today, investment agencies are rated according to how much financing they can bring. In some cases, this should be reconsidered. We should not just assess the amount of money, but the quality of financing, so that the financing they attract fulfills certain minimum sustainability criteria. Maybe I can add something. I think that financial investments are quite important for the installation of renewable energies in Argentina. But I wanted to comment on the supply chains to see how to reduce dependency. It's true, many technologies come from abroad. China is a leader in solar power, and it will be a leader in wind power. We have to see how to create partnerships. For example, South Africa is an interesting country where they are taking a look at the value chain to see what they can produce locally and how these imports can be replaced. It's a big issue. It depends on the sector. We always consider the case of the wind power. In many places, it is possible to produce wind power locally. Turbines, blades. I think that many items could be subsidized to produce them locally. In terms of co-benefits, it's interesting that a company like YPF went to the ILO. YPF is increasingly exploring renewable energies, not just in oil and gas. They are also interested in social issues and how to include the community where they operate. I think that these are interesting signals that these companies, for example, in Germany this is more extreme. There are big electrical corporations which, as a result of regulatory pressure, laws, and the energy policy which favors renewable energies, have diversified much more. We have also heard about Sweden. There are diversification trends, diversifying into renewable energies. It is interesting that these big companies have an interest in social issues too. They are interested in environmental and social issues. We must put more pressure on the companies interested in these topics. And there's also the attitude of consumers. Consumers also have a power. They also can put pressure. I lived in Austria and I work for UNIDO. We separated the Tetra Paks to recycle. But in Austria, at the time, there was no recycling plant. So I always say the population was realistic with the technology that they were lacking, but I think that This is also important. We should raise awareness in society about environmental issues so that this pressure can be created. We can take the case of solar panels. The technology is quite standardized now. There are many devices that work on solar power. In many houses, this can be an interesting alternative. We need to see how this can be supported financially. Solar water heaters. And now we will close the panel because we are quite behind schedule. Regarding the last point, the interests of fossil fuel industries, Annabella said that Trump's success is based precisely on those left behind and those who are taking advantage. That is fossil fuels. They are in power now. That's an interesting reaction. It was exactly after the Paris Agreement and they took over the government of the most powerful country in the world. They are at the defensive. Many political powers are not controlled by them, but others are. And this process contributes to mobilize actors which are doubtful about their role in the energy transition. But they can be mobilized to see that we have to work for the common good, to work for process goods. I liked what you said, Christoph. The process is quite important, how things are done. What we want is to explore how to conduct transition. This is already in ILO documents, in ITUC documents, and also in the documents of the Framework Convention, but we need to understand how to do it, and that's the idea of this conversation. Now, given schedule issues, I think we should have lunch and return to listen to the presentations of Tabaré and panel 2, supply chains. This panel will discuss technologies, I hope, among many other things. I would like to thank all our panel members. Thank you, Kai. Thank you very much. Let's have lunch here and let's reconvene later. Let's reconvene at 1:30 p.m.